Across the frozen plains of Russia in 1941, 1 in every 4 German tanks rolling toward Moscow was not German at all. It was Czechoslovak, built in Prague, designed by an enemy, and yet without it, the Blitzkrieg might never have reached Smolensk. This is the story of the Panzer 38T, the stolen weapon that became the workhorse of Hitler's panzer divisions. When most people picture German armor from World War II, they see tigers and panthers, massive steel beasts bristling with firepower. But in the crucial first years of the war, during the invasions that shocked the world, Germany's armored fist relied on something much smaller, something they hadn't even built themselves. March 1939, German forces march into Czechoslovakia. The world watches as one of Europe's most advanced industrial nations disappears from the map without a shot fired. But Hitler isn't just claiming territory, he's claiming an arsenal. Within days, the Wehrmacht catalogues its prize, 424 modern light tanks, 50 production examples of one of the finest designs in Europe, and perhaps most valuable of all, the intact factories to build more. The Czechs called it the LTVZ-38. The Germans would rename it the Panzerkampfwagen 38T, the T standing for Czechish, Czech. Even in designation, they admitted whose genius made it possible. To understand why this tank mattered, you need to understand Germany's desperate situation in 1939. The rearmament program had produced quantity over quality. The Panzer I was barely a tank at all, armed only with machine guns. The Panzer II carried a 20mm cannon insufficient against modern armor. The Panzer III and IV existed, but in painfully small numbers. Germany was preparing to invade Poland with an armored force that on paper looked impressive, but in reality was dangerously inadequate. Then came the Czech windfall. The LTVZ-38 had been designed by engineers at Českomoravská Kolbendanik, known simply as CKD, in Prague. They'd started work in 1937, racing to create a tank that could meet the requirements of an increasingly dangerous Europe. The Czech military wanted a light tank that balanced firepower, armor, and above all reliability, something that could be produced in numbers, something that worked. The design that emerged was remarkably clean, conventional in layout but refined in execution. The hull was made from welded and riveted armor plates, simpler to manufacture than the complex casting some nations preferred. The armor was 25mm thick at the front, modest but adequate for a light tank, sloped in places to improve effectiveness. The armament centered on a 37mm Škoda A7 gun, not the most powerful weapon on a battlefield, but accurate and reliable, capable of penetrating 30mm of armor at 500 meters, enough to threaten any light or medium tank it was likely to meet in 1939. The gun could elevate to plus 12 degrees and depress to minus 10. Good visibility for the crew. Good gun handling. The crew of 4 worked in what was, by the standards of the era, a relatively spacious interior, commander and gunner in the turret, driver and whole machine gunner in the front. Radio equipment was standard. Not every tank force in Europe could say that in 1939, but the real genius was in the engineering. CKD designed the 38 around a Praga EPA inline 6-cylinder engine producing 125 horsepower. It doesn't sound like much, but the entire tank weighed only 9.7 tons. That gave it a power-to-weight ratio that left many contemporaries struggling to keep up. Top speed of 42 kilometers per hour on roads. More importantly, it could sustain that speed. It could run all day without breaking down. The suspension used a leaf spring system. Simple, easy to maintain, easy to repair in the field. German crews would come to love this. While their Panzer IIIs threw tracks and snapped torsion bars, the 38T just kept moving. When German technical teams inspected the captured tanks and factories, they found something unexpected. This wasn't just a good tank. In some ways, it was better than anything Germany was currently producing in the light tank class. The Panzer II, it would replace carried less armor, a weaker gun, and broke down more often. The decision was immediate. Production would continue, not as a captured curiosity, but as a frontline panzer. CKD Prague, now under German control and renamed BMM, received orders to maintain full production. The workers were Czech, the engineers were Czech, the expertise was Czech. Germany simply stepped in to claim the output. Production accelerated. Small modifications were made for German use. New radios, new optical equipment, turret changes to accommodate German vision devices. But the fundamental design remained untouched. Why fix what wasn't broken? By the time Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the first Panzer 38T tanks were already being issued to panzer divisions. The Poles faced them without ever knowing they were fighting Czech engineering. Then came the invasion of France. The Wehrmacht fielded over 1,400 tanks of all types. 228 of them were Panzer 38T models. They proved faster and more reliable than many of their supposedly superior German cousins. Commanders requested more. Production continued to climb. BMM Prague worked around the clock. 1,414 Panzer 38T tanks would be built before production finally shifted to other variants. 1,414 tanks that Germany never had to design, never had to develop, simply took the numbers tell their own story. By June 1941, when Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, 16 Panzer divisions were equipped with the Panzer 38T, 16 divisions that represented roughly 25% of Germany's entire Panzer arm. 1 in 4 German tanks crushing into Russia came from Prague. The tiny Czechoslovak tank had become essential to the German war machine. The dust clouds that rose over the Russian steppe in the summer of 1941 carried within them a terrible irony. Czech workers in Prague had built machines that now ground toward Moscow. Czech engineering was being used to enslave the very nations that Czechoslovakia might have stood beside. The Panzer 38T went to war in conditions its designers never imagined. The LT-VZ-38 had been built for European warfare, paved roads, moderate climates, battles measured in kilometers. Russia offered none of this. It offered mud that swallowed tanks whole, dust that choked engines, distances that broke the wheel, and cold that froze oil solid. The 38T survived it all better than it had any right to. Crews reported back with something approaching disbelief. While Panzer IIIs and IVs littered the roadside with mechanical failures, the 38T kept running. That simple Praga engine, designed for reliability over performance, proved nearly indestructible. That basic leaf spring suspension, mocked by some German engineers as primitive, needed almost no maintenance. In the killing fields of the Eastern Front, simplicity became a virtue beyond price. The 6th Panzer Division drove their 38T models over 1,000 kilometers in the opening weeks of Barbarossa, through villages and forests, across rivers, on makeshift bridges that shouldn't have held. The tanks kept pace. Some units reported mechanical availability rates above 90%, extraordinary for sustained combat operations, but reliability couldn't mask the growing problem. The 37mm gun that had been adequate in 1939 was dangerously obsolete by 1942. Soviet T-34 tanks began appearing in numbers. Sloped armor, 76mm guns. The 38T could barely scratch them. Crews had to aim for tracks, for vision ports, for desperate flanking shots. It was no longer a fight between peers, it was survival. German doctrine adapted. The 38T was pulled from spearhead duties and assigned to reconnaissance roles, to infantry support, to security operations behind the lines. It could still kill lighter Soviet tanks. It could still destroy trucks and gun positions. But the glory days of racing across France were over, and yet the chassis lived on. German engineers, impressed by the reliability, began to see the 38T not as a tank but as a platform. If the turret was obsolete, remove it. Build something else on that dependable hull. The Marder III tank destroyer emerged, a 38T chassis with the turret removed and a 75mm anti-tank gun bolted on top. Crude, top-heavy, but it worked. Suddenly, the humble Czech design could kill T-34s at range. Over 900 Marder IIIs were built. Then came the Grill self-propelled infantry gun. The Hetzer tank destroyer, lower and meaner, with a redesigned hull but still fundamentally Czech engineering. Flak Panzer 38 anti-aircraft variants. Munitions carriers, recovery vehicles. The 38T chassis appeared in over a dozen variants. Production continued until May 1945. More than 11,000 vehicles in total based on that original Czech design. No other captured tank in history was exploited so thoroughly or remained in production so long under a conqueror's flag. But how did it actually compare to its contemporaries? Against the Soviet T-26, the 38T was faster and more reliable, with comparable firepower. Against early models of the T-34, it was completely outclassed in protection and hitting power, though it remained more mechanically dependable. Against the British cruiser tanks of the period, it was roughly equivalent, better reliability, similar armor and gun, inferior to later designs but competitive with what it actually faced in 1939 and 40. The American M3 Stuart light tank, which began arriving in numbers in 1942, represented the next generation. Better armor, better gun depression. But the 38T was still mechanically simpler and easier to maintain in the field. What set the Panzer 38T apart wasn't revolutionary technology, it was engineering maturity. The Czechs had built a tank that worked, that kept working, that could be mass-produced by skilled workers using existing industrial capacity. In the chaos of global war, those qualities mattered more than cutting-edge innovation. So, Why is it forgotten? Why does history remember the Tiger and the Panther while the tank that equipped a quarter of Germany's Panzer force in 1941 gathers dust in memory? Perhaps because the truth is uncomfortable. The 38T's story is one of occupation and theft, of a small nation's engineering genius turned against its friends. There's no glory in that, no clean narrative of German innovation or Allied triumph, just the brutal calculus of conquest and exploitation. Or perhaps it's simpler. The 38T was successful precisely because it was unremarkable. It didn't break records, it didn't win spectacular victories, it simply showed up day after day and did its job. History remembers the exceptional, the reliable gets taken for granted. The last Panzer 38T models surrendered in the ruins of Berlin in May 1945. Some were captured intact and evaluated by Soviet and Allied forces. A few survive in museums today. Small, riveted, unremarkable to the untrained eye. But each one represents a masterpiece of pre-war Czech engineering and a tragedy of what might have been. If you want to discover more forgotten weapons that shaped history from the shadows, subscribe. There are more stories waiting to be told.